Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad to be here with my friend Kevin Johnson. We've been talking for years online in the comments, as you just said, sharing dad jokes and talking about theology and being fun nerds in the various ways that we do. But this is our first time face to face, so it's really great. Yeah, so maybe I'll pass it to you, Kevin. I'd like to just hear where you're at and where you're coming from, and I wanted to hear a bit about the work that you're doing and you're transitioning some of your focus.
Yeah, Justin, thank you so much for the invitation. I so just broadly speaking, I mean, I think you know, but maybe for your audience or to remind you, I mean, my background is I come to this from a theology degree background. So, I mean, the big plan for me is I was a religion major in college, and I was really considering kind of ministerial work, priesthood, or something like that. I was raised Roman Catholic. I thought that was going to be the case, but then I met my wife, and that kind of took the priesthood off the table. And then I had professors who basically said to me, "Don't get a degree in religion. There's really not a lot of jobs, and it's hard." So I kind of hung that up for a while, and I practiced law for a number of years. Actually, I went to law school and did that, but it just it sucked the life out of me. I just couldn't do it. And pretty quickly, my wife and I were married, and I said to my wife, I said, I just can't do this, and so I said I was going to apply to grad school, and she says, well, if you get in, let's see. So I got in, and then she says, yeah, let's do it. Let's see if we can arrange this financially. So I then went back to get my master's at Yale, and I was there for a while, and I thought, I'm just going to go and just keep doing. I'm just going to go and get the PhD. I just don't know. I mean, maybe I can't get a job, but I love this stuff. So theology was my background. And then what ended up happening is for financial reasons, I had to like teach a little bit. So I had to stop going full time for my master's, I was teaching at a private Catholic school an all boys school for, college prep, and was doing religion there, and then finished and thought, oh, I'll just be a teacher or something. Here's my vocational work, and maybe I'll do some spiritual direction stuff. But I just really wanted to be more and more deeper and deeper into the theology. So I went back and got for my doctoral work at Boston College. And then after again, my professors were right. There just really are not a lot of jobs tenure track wise. A lot of my friends have PhDs. There are adjuncts everywhere. We're all struggling for jobs. So I've been adjuncting at universities for a few years, and specifically, I've been at one in Connecticut for since 2006. And while doing that work and my research for my doctoral work and everything, I was really focused on kind of silence and silent prayer and the need for that. And while doing that, I was posting my work online and bumped into via online spaces, these wonderful places. I bumped into two people who were also interested in silent stuff. And we started like sharing things on Twitter and other places and said, you know, there's something here. We collaborate pretty well. We're doing some things. What if we started a podcast? And so that got us into Encountering Silence. For so the Encountering Silence podcast started in like 2017, and we went for a good long time. And we're still active now, but the number of episodes have kind of dropped down and slowed down because my co-host Carl McColeman, who's a kind of a popular spiritual writer out there, and Cassidy Hall she was also become a good writer, and she's now involved in ministry. So we started doing some things, and we still doing some things, but now all three of us have kind of gotten pulled in various directions. And as I was saying before we got online, the Encountering Silence is still going, and we're trying to see if we can keep it going. So I'm not saying it's over, and I'm not telling anybody who's a fan, be upset or anything. More episodes are actually coming. I edit them, and I have another one that I have to edit and release, and I'm hoping to do that soon. But balancing school, I'm basically teaching full time at this point, and a family. But I've slowly shifted my focus on silence and silent prayer and contemplation has more and more unpacked for me the idea of the body and how the body is really, really an essential piece. And as I was doing more of that work theologically, it was always crossing over too with kind of environmental stuff and climate change and things like that. And then before I knew it, my degree anyway is comparative theology. As a Roman Catholic theologian, how can I study with, learn from, and embrace other traditions without converting them and without converting me? Holding that space. That's what comparative theology does. It says you come from a point of view and you say your point of view is true and accurate. But then what happens when you engage others who say they have a different point of view that's true and accurate? How do you do that theologically? And I've just always loved that. It's a little different than kind of interspiritual and interreligious dialogue. It's a little more rigorous theologically, but it hangs in similar circles. So because my comparative mind and I'm so used to doing that work, I was doing a lot of contemplative comparisons. I would hang out in yoga places. I would hang out in Buddhist circles. I was doing stuff with Taoists. And now I've been spending a lot of time in the last few years with Aboriginal and Native spiritualities, which has reminded me of my kind of ancestors and kind of Celtic and Scandinavian kind of practices that were animist and pre-Christian kind of precursor things. And so I've just been doing more and more stuff that's kind of cultural change stuff and embodied stuff. And then I just recently, last January, received certification with the International Focusing Institute. And focusing is a contemporary practice that was developed in the 1950s at the University of Chicago by a psychologist and a philosopher, Eugene Genlin. And he was trying to recover this embodied kind of knowing and bringing it into therapy. But then he, as a philosopher, and he was like, this isn't just therapeutic. This is how bodies and humans know the world. And our culture with the mind body split forgets that in the West. And so he developed this new technique, and it is new, focusing's new, but he recognized, and he's given interviews, and it's interesting, you can go on YouTube and find them, and he used to talk to people. He was well versed in the mystical and contemplative traditions around the world. And he recognized this is what he was doing was just kind of a modern update with what a lot of is done in all those ancient traditions. And so I've kind of doing that now. I see clients and do focusing with them and teach them that the body knows the world and not just the mind. And then that connects me with a lot of contemplative, a lot of animist practices, a lot of yogic practices, tantric practices. And it's really, really kind of exploded my view of Christianity, like in a wonderful way. It helps me understand Celtic Christianity in ways that I didn't before. It was more theoretical. Now it's an embodied sense of it. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I'm looking to eventually do more stuff online, have communal spaces, and do things in this area that's much more what I call wild theology, which is more about the body in touch with the world. So that's a long intro, but that's where my background, and that's kind of what I've shifted into.
Oh, well, that's awesome because there's a whole bunch of million things that we could talk about in there.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, embodied practices are really big for me, and so is the animist piece. I mean, a lot of people listening will know, but I'll just say again, like my background, I grew up Quaker,
Yeah.
and so in the
That's
Quaker
awesome.
tradition, there's a lot of silence. And it's not at all an antibody tradition in any way, like some are, but it's not an embodied spiritual practice either. You know, you're just
Right.
sitting there in silence and you're talking and stuff.
Right.
Um, so it kind of had, I didn't get any of that, evangelical hate your body stuff, anything like that, but I also didn't have any embodied practices, so to speak, in that. But at the same time, I also grew up going to indigenous ceremony, Anishinaabe ceremony, Ojibwe
Oh, that's
ceremony
awesome.
mostly. From the time I was little. So my mom was a hippie and brought me to ceremony from when I was a kid. I did my first sweat when I was 12, and
Wow. You're
um,
so lucky. That's awesome.
yeah, yeah, and I was deeply formed in that tradition. As a teenager, I kind of became an anarchist punk rocker and did different things.
Yeah.
But then in my 20s, I came back to ceremony really strongly, and for about 10 years, I was very, very involved with a number of different elders and medicine people and different kinds of
Wonderful.
ceremonies and stuff like that. And so it was really where my spiritual formation as an adult happened was in an indigenous. Um, Animist isn't a word that they would use, but
No, not at all.
when I look up animist on Wikipedia, it says Ojibwe. So I think it's what it's trying to describe anyway.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, totally.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Aboriginal and indigenous traditions, they might not identify that. I think animist is more kind of a like a theoretical academic term that's used to talk about it. And in fact, I don't know if you know the podcaster Josh Schrei, but I mean, I highly encourage you and anyone who's interested in this stuff. He has a podcast called The Emerald, and he sounds like he has a very similar background to you. He was raised by kind of, as he calls them, hippie parents. He was raised in a Zen Buddhist kind of setting, but then they went to India and he was deeply involved in like Tantra and yoga there, learned Sanskrit. But then it was just fully into the indigenous, where he realized that it wasn't just contemplative practices, but that these kind of folk practices of like going on pilgrimage to go see a sacred rock and just wait in hours of lines to go see a rock, you know? And he's like, the modern person's like, what does that mean? You know? But he's like, but when you see the rock, he says, you'll understand. Like it really is something. And he's talking about in that podcast, this sense of recovering the animate vision of humanity, that like that whole idea of that kind of consciousness, trance states, in between states, not seeking extraordinary just to trip and be happy, and but to actually say that he's very responsible in the sense that I'm not trying to exoticize this or make it like, oh, they're awesome and we are horrible. He's saying, no, there's a piece here that's really important for humanity for centuries upon centuries. And then just in the last 500 years, we just stopped doing that stuff in the West. I mean, and we can trace it that it slowly was disappearing, but it was gone after about 500 years ago. I mean, and now you have these people kind of saying that might have been a mistake. And I'm right there. So, so he even says in the podcast that animist, that word is just made up by like 18th and 19th century people to talk about like what humans did and then why we don't do it. He's like, if you look up the definition, it's kind of funny. He's like, you have to assume that, there's something right or wrong about your position when you see the definition. He's like, it was just normal. Like if you asked an indigenous person, they would just be like, these are human things to do. This is how it is to be human, and we're the only ones who think like, in the West, the Enlightenment mind, in the 17th and 18th centuries or whatever, thinking that a rock is dead. And he was like, not when I'm going to India and we're waiting in line to talk to the rock. He's like, we don't think it's dead there. Yeah. So yeah, indigenous people wouldn't say it that way. They just recognize it as their culture and their way and their kin, their relations. They'd have different ways of talking about the spirit, and the people that support them so that they can be human. Animist is just like an outsider term.
Yeah. But we need a term in some ways because it's been lost in our cultural consciousness. I think we need, and I
Totally.
struggle with the term a bit because of all the things you just said, but then also I want a word for it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah, I
because
don't
I've
I don't
I've
judge
gone on
anyone who uses
pilgrimage
it.
to see a sacred rock. I've done that many times.
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
yeah. I'm sure you have. It sounds like you
and
have. Yeah.
and and that's important to me. And it's hard to find the Christian language to talk about it because I, I mean, in my experience, I went to seminary for a while with the United Church of Canada, which is a mainline Protestant. It's like as quintessentially mainline Protestant as you can get. Very
Yep.
Enlightenment thinking, good liberal social values, but very much, an Enlightenment religion
Yes.
without information kind of tradition.
Yep.
Um, and I was just dumbfounded when I got there because I had had all of the spiritual formation and ceremony leading up to that. And I was expecting not to find the same thing, obviously, but expecting to find some kind of equivalent that like I hadn't gotten in my local church yet because I hadn't gone to seminary. And that's where I would learn the deep Christian spiritual practices. And then I realized that they weren't going to teach me any deep Christian
Mm,
spiritual practices.
no.
Mm.
No, I mean, and
Yeah.
and you're 100% right. I mean, it's sad actually. They kind of that mind body split that we can start pointing the fingers about where it came. I mean, you could start pointing at like Plato maybe starting to do it, and then you can start to see like other people, and they keep building on each other, and then we get all the way up to Descartes, and then people will blame Descartes, but then people who've read Descartes go, he's not doing that. We've misread him. Like, so I mean, I don't know who you point the finger at, but like that's what happened, to us. And like you said, we've just educated ourselves out of it. And so now, isn't it, it says something, right? That here you were exposed to ceremony, you had this deep, what we would call in the Christian tradition, kind of a mystagogical induction into kind of native spirituality, into indigenous and aboriginal spiritual traditions. And then you got to your tradition, and all they wanted you to do was think abstractly about it. It's like, and I mean, it's not just you. I point the finger right back at me. I mean, I've had something very similar. I was actually excited when I first, because I was a nerd, so when they told me, hey, you could think about Christianity really deeply, that was interesting to me, because I was raised in a tradition that, like, so I was Roman Catholic, but there was a lot of, I have Irish background. And so the Irish, if you trace that out, there's a lot of like kind of Jansenist kind of approaches that came across. And so that really influenced kind of like a lot of the Irish seminaries and a lot of the Irish Catholics in the United States. And so then you got that really fed the anti-body kind of thing, body is evil. And kind of mind was equivalent to spirit and soul. And so thinking and stuff was great, you know, and so it kind of lines up with that kind of Protestant work ethic. So it's the Catholic version of a Protestant work ethic kind of thing. And so then thinking's the way, and yet here I am in a Catholic tradition that has the mystical body of Christ and all these things and all the saints and the contemplation and a monastic tradition. And it just seems to be shunted somewhere, So yeah, I do not discredit anyone for using the word animist. I understand the problems with the word, but like we need something to point back. Because I do believe, I think you probably do too. I do believe that Christians had it. I,
Well,
I really do. I
I
do.
mean, I was just thinking as you're saying that, that if you go back to the medieval texts and try and figure out what they were up to, they also made pilgrimages to sacred rocks.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Like it's
Absolutely.
lots of Christian tradition of making pilgrimages to sacred rocks and other sacred various things, a saint's
Absolutely.
arm and a tree and whatever the case may be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
So
I and if you go all the way back, like I get the sense. I mean, because we lost them, but I mean the Desert Masters stuff. A lot of that stuff, the men and women there, that was an oral tradition, and that is part of kind of the animist like ceremony thing. You know, Again, another problematic word, but like if you're thinking something along shamanic, that word gets overused and abused. But again, trying to point to something, but that whole realm is oral lineage, and we just lost those lineages because they, institutional churches and empire and all sorts of things crushed that. So, we don't have kind of practices and things that probably were shared, body to body, and story and ceremony and thing that would have been, I'm pretty sure Christians had it. And now all we have are writings that make it sound like we never had it, So it's kind of covering the trails. You read, if you go looking, it's like, it makes it sound like, no, we never did any of that. That was pagan and horrible. And I'm like, I'm not convinced that's true.
yeah,
But
not at all. And even in the scriptures themselves, I mean, you really have to have a kind of modern bias when you're reading the scriptures to not see it. Quakers in Canada weren't concerned much about the Bible. I didn't get any Bible classes as a kid. I went to all the
right,
Quaker stuff and I was super involved, but none of it was Bible study. So I had
right.
never read the Gospels until I was an adult, and after I had done a whole lot of ceremony. And I remember reading, you don't have to go very far in the Gospels before Jesus goes out into the wilderness to fast and has his vision quest or whatever, right? It's
Boom.
another word, vision quest, that we didn't actually use in ceremony. We just call it going out on a fast.
Yeah,
But
totally.
I remember reading it and thinking, well, I go on 4 days and 4 nights without food or water in the wilderness by myself, just like he did 40 days. I mean, he's gonna, one up me on that, obviously, because he's Jesus. But
Yeah,
um,
I mean, and then you
like,
recognize that the numbers themselves might not be accurate numbers. They could be symbolic numbers, and
yeah.
but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the Psalms are full of the waves clapping and the trees singing and the rocks. Jesus says the stones will cry out, and I mean the scriptures are full of all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
we
I
we like somehow have blinders on to it, I think.
totally. I'm
Yeah.
teaching a class. I've actually created a class at my university now, and I think eventually. I don't think the university is the right place for it. I think it eventually needs a communal space and probably something that's a little more spiritual. And I'm really walking a tightrope there because it's supposed to be an academic thing, and it is. I have shifted in. So anyone who's listening from my university, they can come on in. It's academic currently, but it's kind of set up for me eventually to take it from an academic setting and do something more spiritual with it. But it's a class I created called Wild Theology. And I started doing it a few years ago. And at first, it was as usual, it's just lousy. I kind of was like throwing spaghetti at the wall and saying, well, I don't know what, and what books would I use, and how would I even do this? And there aren't sources for this. And I'd have to, but now I've gotten to the place where I'm a little bit, it's getting better. And I think now, like you just said, I could even do a whole couple of weeks maybe of just, hey, let's read the scriptures and see all the places where kind of the wildness comes through. Um, and my pitch really, you probably recognize this too, but the independent Bible scholar, Margaret Barker, I've been following her work for years, and she's basically making the argument. And at first it was kind of like she was by herself with a handful of other people, but it's grown. I'm not sure she's the minority or majority voice at this point, but she's more respected. She's written a number of books, and she's making the argument that the Hebrews basically had this kind of primal indigenous tribal way of being that was before they became deeply monotheist and reduced down to kind of a law-based kind of thing. That if you go back and check in some of the writings and some of the scrolls and stuff, she's like, there's all sorts of evidence with the Hebrew that, this looks a little bit more, like ceremony and primal and indigenous and stuff in a Hebrew setting. And then she kind of makes the pitch that what Jesus is doing is basically recovering that when he goes off into the desert and stuff, they're like maybe the people at Qumran, the Essenes, maybe a group of other people were holding that Hebrew tradition, that oral tradition going, and that Jesus could have found out because she's like, Jesus says these things that are deeply Hebrew and deeply Old Testament and deeply wild. And it looks much more nature based and much more ceremony based and much more healing and medicine, looking for medicine. And he looks more like that than he does look like a priest in the temple, or anything else. So it's kind of interesting. I know it's all hypothetical and, we're reading between the lines and trying to uncover lost sources. But when you start to put the things together, you start to say that, hey, that makes a lot of sense. That interprets that Bible verse pretty well, and it shows the use of it in Hebrew and the connection to rabbis. And it's just fascinating. So, yeah.
Well, that sounds awesome. You're lucky students.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fun because, and so now I'm that wild theology. So I'm doing all that and basically making the argument that you've made. I'm saying Christianity is basically, I said, I'm going to be a little provocative. I'm going to tell you that Christianity really is a kind of a wild, primal, indigenous practice. I was like, and I said, I know now I got my work cut out for me. Right. And so, but I throw it down and say, like, let's look. And so then we listen to and look at some things about animism and indigenous things and ceremony and stuff. And we see, and then we go, hey, look, and the students will say, oh my Lord, this looks, once you see kind of animist cultures and you see what ceremony's doing and you read about African and South American and Celtic and you just see what all these cultures are doing. And then you just go, okay, now look at Jesus. And you read a couple sermons and you read some of the language and you look and you go, one of my students goes, how is this not what we've been reading? And I go, yeah, that's kind of what it feels like to me too. How is this not that?
Yeah, for sure. I wonder, we've kind of deconstructed and problematized the word animism, but I wonder if we could go in the other direction with it, and if maybe you could share like what
Yeah.
what it does mean and what's lying behind the word for you.
Yeah. So I use it in my class, even though it's problematic. I do use it like you, because I need a word. I use it similar the way to the philosopher David Abram, who wrote the book The Spell of the Sensuous, says about it. And so animism basically, it's just coming from the Greek, right? So this idea of anima. So it is movement and energy. And so where we get spirit and kind of soul, maybe if we translate those words. And so they sense that everything has kind of an energy source behind it or a movement behind it, that everything it has that in it, right? And I don't have to even be far removed from my modern science. I mean, I'm just thinking things like gravity, things like ultraviolet rays, radiation, atomic energy. That all that stuff moves. All that has kind of a spirit or an essence to it, and an embodied felt way of like what moves that thing, and that's how it lives. And so that gets you on the ground, that gets you moving, like saying, okay, well, we're just talking about the sense of what moves you, what motivates you, what's the energy behind things. And then you start to realize that we're living in a living world, that everything is alive and interchanging things. And that even if you look at things like rocks or, what we would consider, quote, inanimate, is really there's movement. We know that atoms vibrate and electrons move, and there's all sorts of stuff going on that our bodies are aware of, and that more and more science is now starting to what sounded like weird, what I might have called it weird years ago and unscientific and kind of like woo woo spiritual stuff that I couldn't prove. Science now with kind of quantum physics and the neuroscience and consciousness studies, and they're all saying, hey, our body kind of knows more things than we realize, and there's like subconscious knowing and intuition and all sorts of things that sounds like magic really aren't. It's just part of what a body is. And so then if you start to realize, okay, if my body's alive doing these kinds of things and it's not just a brain, I'm not a walking brain on a stick, but my body knows the world too. Well, then if my hand can know the world, and you hear scientists saying stuff like that, that your hand can register pain faster than the nerve endings shooting up to your brain. Your hand moves away faster than the nerve can even tell it. So the hand knows before the brain knows. And so if my hand can know the world and can sense the world, then why not a plant? Especially since I can see a plant turning toward the sun, and so you start to realize, okay, so animism in that direction, I just start off with the basic kind of idea of movement and living and kind of energy, and then it just kind of unfolds from there. And then we like unfold kind of what we mean by spirit. Spirit doesn't have to be some abstract thing. We could just mean the spirit of something, what moves it, you know. Um, and it really can just be as simple as bodies have spirit. Bodies have energy. They move. They're living. Um, And if you take that seriously, if you take that scientifically seriously, it just feels like we're smack dab in something that looks like what is animism, right? The sense that everything kind of moves, everything lives in some way, and there might be various levels of it, but it does. And then we have access to it, that one can become aware of it if one turns their attention to it. So,
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I know in my formation and ceremony, my elder would always say that everything is alive.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and he would not, we wouldn't just make the pilgrimage to the rock, we talk to the rock.
That's right. That's
We'd
right.
ask it for wisdom and for guidance and for help. Um,
As you should,
as
right? I
one should,
mean,
as one should.
yeah.
Um, and it's interesting because I've tried to bring that over and I've scoured all these medieval texts looking for stuff like that. And you can find it in some really cool places. And one of the things you were talking about stones that popped into my head is Aelred of Rievaulx,
Mhm.
the Cistercian father from he's right on the Scottish-English border in the High Middle Ages.
Yeah,
And he's
absolutely.
he's this wonderful, wonderful writer, profound and also charming and down to earth. And anyway, in his book Spiritual Friendship, he gives this sort of little explanation of the whole of the cosmos and how everything has friendship built into
Yes.
it, that it's part of
Yes.
the fabric of reality. And he does this kind of Aristotelian thing. He starts with rocks and then plants, animals, and kind of moves up the scale
Chain
of
of being.
the
Yeah.
chain of
Yeah.
being, right?
Yeah.
But I love that he starts with rocks and he says rocks demonstrate friendship. When you till your field, you're not going to find all these random rocks. You're going to find a community of similar rocks living together, and that
That's awesome.
they demonstrate friendship. And then he says when you walk through the forest, you see a grove of oaks, a grove of birch, and the trees also come together and live in this community and this sense of friendship. And he goes through the whole hierarchy of it all. Talks about animals having friendship, which is pretty obvious and easy to wrap our heads around. He talks about angels having friendship, and even though they exist in the nine ranks of the
Right.
celestial hierarchy, he says one might mistakenly think that some are better than others if the gift of charity and friendship didn't unite them in a common bond, so that there is no superior angel. There's just ones that are more expansive or less expansive, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the really cool things that you wouldn't expect for someone writing in the 12th century is that he takes the Adam and Eve story and he says God separated Eve from Adam from his side so that she's neither above him nor below him, but
That's
is
right.
lateral is the word he uses. They're collateral. They're equal beside each other because uh, friendship, the quality of friendship is that there is neither superior nor inferior, just like in the angels and just like in everything. And so for
Yeah.
Aelred, the whole of the cosmos, from rocks to angels to trees and animals and human beings, is imbued with a natural tendency towards friendship and a desire to live in an equally harmonious, non-oppressive way, and that's the foundation of the universe. And I think that that's such a cool thing. And he's Orthodox too. He didn't even get called a heretic,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know.
and
But
and the beauty of that, do you see, like that's a beautiful example. I mean, I love his writing on friendship, and I'm so glad you bring that up, because it's just a perfect example. But look at that example. Here's a Christian, right? A Catholic. Here he is. He's doing the kind of contemplative practices. And what is the assumption here? There's this worldview assumption underneath that the world is really, really good, and it's everything's interrelated. I mean, and yes, that's the Christian worldview, but at the same time, you can tell he brought that into his religion, right? I mean, he must have been taught as a child, you know, what the you're saying he's on the Scottish kind of border there. I mean, he's picking up from the people in his culture in his time. This is how we see the world. Everything's interconnected. Everything shares everything. We by that's still the year 1000. So yeah, okay, we have cities. Yeah, okay, we're doing agriculture, but we're still so connected to nature. We're still so involved in the world and the land, and you just can't think of the human being separate from it. It wouldn't even make sense. So if there's a spiritual teaching here, the spiritual teaching has to make sense. If it's truth, it's got to be truth about the whole of the universe, the cosmos, right? It's not even a universe; it's a cosmos. It's a community of just oneness, and interrelation that you're talking about there. But then you read something, read a theologian who's writing in the 18th or 19th or 20th century. You're not going to see a worldview that assumes that at all. In fact, you're going to see a worldview that's going to have to try to argue for community and argue, like, why aren't we separated and how we should see ourselves because if you're living in an enlightenment kind of way and you don't see the body knowing, then you're separate, right? I mean, it's just the two, as simple as that. If you put it that way, like linear mind and thinking mind separates things, and you see yourself as a separate self from the world, and that's a wonderful tool, and it's great. We should do that. That's fine. But an embodied knowing catches the relationships. If you want to know with your body, you have to relate. You have to place it in its proper, and that's why you go on that pilgrimage and talk to the rock and show respect, and have humility and talk to it. It's why I love, St. Francis of, calling brother, sun, sister, moon, that whole sense of everything in the cosmos is equal to me. I'm just part of creation, like that's really kind of radical when you have the sense in the Genesis, and people have interpreted it that humans are so above everything else, we're the higher beings or whatever. And Francis is kind of still holding on to kind of an older worldview. He's right at the cusp where kind of capitalism's kicking in, and city life and the humanism's about to kick in hard. And he's right there at the cusp. And he's still got that older worldview of, hey, everything's connected, right? We're all, and you saw that in the ancient world, I mean, you might not see it if you read like Plato or Aristotle, they were definitely moving in a direction that was clarifying linear reason. And there is a space for that. That's what they were doing. And because they were trying to clarify linear reason, all their language kind of like pushes us in the direction that looks something like enlightenment. But if you dig under the surface, even Plato and them, there's all sorts of mythology. There's all sorts of embodiment. I mean, Socrates has his daemon that he talks to. I mean, that's he's hang. And I read a really great book about how Greek philosophy comes out of kind of Greek, and again, lack of better word, Greek shamanism.
Yeah.
Like that it was out of ceremony and out of trance states and other, like they were noticing wisdom can happen in these different ways, this kind of ecstatic kind of knowing that come out of ceremony. Uh,
And we tend to
so
think of Greek philosophy today as being all abstract, intellectual, and like you said, they were doing that.
yeah,
But philosophy was not just an abstract discipline; it was an entire way of life. Um,
correct.
it included contemplative
Pythagoras,
practices, it included fasting, it included rituals, it included all kinds of stuff that
correct.
all of the Platonists were doing, and it's only in the modern time, reflecting back, that we've dismissed all that ancient nonsense to get to the true gold of Plato, where it's just
Yeah,
the abstract stuff, sifted out from all of that pre-modern junk, and that's how
yeah.
it gets taught. But it's not the reality of it either.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally. Yeah.
yeah.
And so I'm trying to introduce, it's interesting because what I'm trying to do, it's kind of a little radical, trying to introduce in my classes where, university where they've come and have been trained to do linear reason. And then I'm kind of like pumping the brakes and going, hey, modern brain science and kind of everything else here is kind of pointing back that we made a wrong turn and that good thinking has an embodied piece. And you even hear that like talking about embodied cognition and all sorts of stuff. It's everywhere now. I mean, there's like an entire school of thought called um, embodied critical thinking, and there's kind of all these stuff that's happening in Europe and Asia. They're doing all this kind of research on how the body comes into kind of doing data sets and stuff. I mean, so you would think the most abstract spreadsheets, like it's just so removed from the real world, and they're like, nope, the body comes in there too, and they're doing kind of research on that. So it's everywhere, and so it's slowly going to trickle down into kind of popular culture and the way we teach. And I'm kind of saying to them, hey, this is kind of cutting edge, and I know you're here just to get a college degree and you want to go get a job, but I'm kind of tipping my hand that like if you want to be educated, humans have always done something with the body, and I do the same thing as you said. I point out in Plato where it's happening, and I'm pointing out all the different places going, we really should revisit this. And you get some students who are really excited about it. And then the others who are just there for the degree and they're like confused, like, I don't know what we're doing or why we're doing this. And so it's kind of this weird thing that I'm experimenting with my students to see. But when a student gets it though, they once they see it, they can't unsee it. So I have this really, he's a really good student. He's a really good thinker. And I mean, he just says, he goes, oh my God, Professor Johnson. He's like, this is like a key. Like, because once you see this, he goes, I see it everywhere. I see it in poetry. I see it in history. I'm like, yeah, exactly. You can't help but see it once you catch that humans have always done it like this, you know? So,
We how do we bring back, how do we revive what was there, and also create new things, because both of those are important. But like
mm,
what kind of embodied practices, what kind of animist, if you want to use that term, practices, do you think we could do, or do you do, if you're willing to share?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's kind of interesting because that's the question I've been asking myself for years. And, to be honest with you, I've been very slow about it for a couple reasons. One, uh, I'm being very careful in the way and respectful about it. I do not want to just grab indigenous practices and other cultures and just kind of appropriate it. Um, a lot of people who look like me, white male, middle class, white, married with kids in a very privileged position, have just kind of colonized and taken stuff that's not theirs and just said, hey, I can do this stuff too. And I recognize that it's someone else's culture and there's other things. So I at first I was a little hesitant about that, but then hanging around with native traditions and people, I've gotten this various kind of, gotten ups and downs, like yes, do something or no, don't, depending upon who you talk to, which makes sense because every human being is going to debate that. So why wouldn't it be in the case in native traditions that they would debate it too? Um, but then the second thing that was interesting to me is if I take seriously the body is that these practices grew out of people in touch with their land, in touch with their context, in touch with their water resources, their animals, right? Their totem, if I was going to use that word, their animals and their ancestors, and depending upon whatever Aboriginal culture, the way they talk about it, and then recognizing the spirit of those places and the spirit of the land and the spirit of, like, a cave or something, realizing that, hey, I'm kind of living in a culture where I'm not engaging in those things. Like, I lock myself indoors. I do not rely on waterways and those, it's kind of an unsustainable practice that we have. And so then that's when it really kind of doubled down for me, this sense of how environmental and sustainable my life needed to be. Like, I'm living this life that's so removed from the natural resources and not in touch with the spirit of the land. I mean, and like you were saying, showing respect. Like, I've lived on this property here, and we say things like I own it, right? My wife and I bought this land, and it's just kind of funny. I mean, uh and I was thinking, it hit me like a week or two ago. I don't know why it's taken me this long, but it hit me. I was like, how come I've never introduced myself to the land? How come I haven't come out here and said, hey, I've kind of been a real rude neighbor. I act like I'm in charge of this place when you've been around a lot longer than me. And I don't know, seen a lot more. So, and I said that to a friend of mine who hangs around in these kinds of circles. And he was like, yeah, he goes, he lives up in Canada. And he was like, I bought a piece of property. And he's like, the very first thing I did, he was like, I went out and says, hi, I'm the new guy in town. And I promised to try to, like, figure out how to be a good neighbor and stuff, like, and so that's when I realized, like, that's what has to happen. Like, I need to put the time in and let the natural kind of creative energy and kind of intuitive instinct, because I'm not going to get it from if I was born into a tribe, an elder would teach me my ways, and I would know the proper ways to treat the squirrel and the water and the rock and the tree with the respect it deserves, and the proper ceremonies and the proper techniques to either hunt or to farm or to plow or to plant or to harvest or to do anything. And that would be the way to relate well. And I don't have those things. And they've been lost because, we've crushed the native traditions, and there's no native tribe in my area here. I mean, I can find one, but, and so the question becomes, like, I guess, start spending some time on the land, start kind of introducing yourself, start kind of looking around and saying, how do other cultures do something similar? What feels right and what I can do? And it's not me playing. There is a little bit of imagination and play at it, but it has to be serious. It can't just be like I don't know. It feels very cosplay. I know some people who pretend they're animists, and it really does feel like they're pretending they're animists. And then I have friends who are doing it right, or have your kind of background. And I would trust someone like yourself way more than, like, one of my friends who kind of went to a weekend workshop and thinks he's an animist now or something. It just so I guess I'm starting to just develop practices. Um, but the doorway in has been for me focusing, honestly, because what happens is that it's a modern take, and I'm a modern person. And so that's a modern take on listening to my body and recovering that sense of not turning that off. And I had an intuitive sense I was doing it anyway, but I just wasn't aware I was doing it. And now that I've done the focusing, a lot of stuff is coming back from my childhood, kind of the ways I was interacting when I was out playing in forests. A lot of stuff, a lot of memories come back of me feeling in touch with kind of trees and hiking in the forest and feeling kind of at home, which is always weird to say because I was such a nerd and such not an outdoor type. Like I was not a survivalist type. I didn't like bad weather. I didn't like being cold. And so they would all be like, Kevin is just not an outdoor person. And I was like, but I kind of am. Like I know it doesn't seem like it, but I kind of am. And so some of that stuff is coming back. And so I'm using focusing, and I'm using it with my students as well, and my clients, and saying, hey, once you wake up these kind of processes, and then if you have a spiritual kind of calling, or a sense of kind of creativity and artistic pull, then start wandering around outdoors and kind of get the sense, like I even so focusing, if you and I were going to do it, you would I it's a kind of a deep listening where you would talk, and I'd be listening to you, and I'd be directing you not to be paying attention to me or to your words, but I'd be pushing your consciousness down into your body.
Oh,
And I'd be like, hey, what's going
fascinating
on here?
ceremony.
Yeah. And I'd be like, what are you feeling right now?
Yeah.
Right. And then and you're like, I feel it here in my chest. There's an energy here in my chest. And I'm like, okay, is there an emotional quality to it? Is there a memory associated with it? Is there a color or a movement? And I'm just getting you to be embodied and noticing that. And so you're connecting your linear mind with your body. Well, instead of just you and me doing it, what would it be like if I walk up to a tree? And since the tree's not going to talk to me, where in my body do I feel the tree? Right. Like I'm not meeting it head to head like I sometimes might approach a human, but I approach the tree and I can feel like maybe all of a sudden I notice my feet and I'm like, oh, I'm rooted. I feel the roots of this tree. It's signaling something in my feet. Right. And then you're like, and then you bring attention there. And then all of a sudden you might have a thought. And where does that thought come from? Is that your body in touch with the tree? Is that imagination? Is that pretend? Right. See, and when you start to go there at first, because I'm a nerdy guy and I trust my thoughts and my thinking, and I was raised to be a scientist and not an animist. And so quickly a skeptical little voice comes up and goes, come on, Kevin. But if I just pay attention with my body and just let the skeptical mind be quiet and go with the body, every time I am surprised at like how accurate the information that comes back to me. And I'm like, you can't dismiss that when something is just so, you experience it as true. And so focusing has been a nice way of waking that part of me up. And then I can walk out into the world and I realize, oh my God, my body is picking up the world's alive. And then I think I can start playing around with, and I think that's probably what's coming, is I'm going to start playing around with what ritual makes sense here in my backyard with these spirits, with these trees, with these squirrels. I have coyote here. We have a bobcat. I've got about 5 red-tailed hawk. And I got a huge community of squirrels and rabbits. Pack of coyote, actually. There's 4 of them. So how do I speak to those spirits? How do I speak to the ground here that's been plowed and stuff? I did say, I will admit this. Years ago, I stopped with the whole lawn care and putting like chemicals on the lawn and everything. And when I stopped, I don't think I ever told anybody this, but when I stopped, I actually put my hand on the ground that day and said, I'm very sorry. I won't do that again. And that was, and so there's just been these kind of spontaneous things that are unplanned that just pop up. And I think that's kind of where I'm heading. And so, and my students know, like I've told them, I've admitted, I was like, yes, I talk to trees. And you can see the look in their eyes, like, you are weird. And I want you all to go talk to a tree. And you can see a couple students are like, nope, never going to do that. So, so yeah, I mean, I'm at the beginning stages. You probably have way more better options of ceremony. I mean, I'd even love to hear things that you're doing. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, personal prayer life, I find myself still going back to what I was taught in ceremony a lot. Whenever I see the moon, I say thank you, Grandma.
oh,
Um,
that's awesome. Yeah.
I can't help but do that. Whenever thunder comes, because the Thunderbirds were really important to me. And so whenever the thunder comes, I sing a ceremony song and I welcome them and I teach my kids. I
Oh, that's amazing. You
and
know
so
the song.
yeah, I know some songs and stuff. Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
God, so good. My
And so we'll,
heart.
like my little baby, the thunder will come and we'll go, oh, habo nimki, which means welcome, welcome thunderbirds, welcome thunder. And so I welcome the thunder whenever it comes because I know that it's bringing something to for me to heal me, not just for me, obviously, because it's for everyone, but
Right, right, right.
it's also just for me. I
Yeah.
feel like,
Yeah, no, I think isn't that's the paradox of the
yeah,
spiritual life? Like on some level it's for everybody, and yet on some level it is just for you. It's
yeah,
both. It's
yeah, yeah, for
yeah,
sure. And one of the things that I do, we used to put down tobacco for everything as like an
yeah,
offering.
absolutely. Yeah.
And when I was doing one of the main ceremonies, like the main thing that I was trained in and spent my time in was fasting camps, vision quests kind of thing. And so my elder would go and check on all the fasters, and I was his kabewish, his helper. So I would like travel with him
Mm,
and carry the bag because he was old and that kind of stuff, and he would give me teachings. And as we would walk like up the mountain from one faster to the next, he'd teach me to say thank you to everything, and to
that's right.
notice what calls to you. And it's that kind of thing you're saying, like what do you where do you feel in your body or whatever.
Yep.
He just called it listening with the heart.
Yes.
And so he'd say, listen with
Yes.
your heart and let the trees and the rocks speak to you. And whenever one speaks to you, stop and put tobacco down. And so that became one of my main practices, just walking through the bush and saying thank you to things. Um,
See, and that's so beautiful. And now the for me, I would love that practice. And like,
yeah,
what would that look like for me? Because I'm not going to have access to tobacco. I know
yeah.
some do corn or cornmeal or something,
So
you
what I
know?
actually do, because I don't use tobacco for that anymore, and as I've trying to transition into Christian things, I've also run into the it's okay, do whatever you want, and please don't use our ceremonies in any way. I've run into that dichotomy.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and so I make the sign of the cross every time I want to put tobacco down. And that's
That's
my
awesome.
my little embodied prayer. And when I look at the moon and I say thank you, Grandma, I make the sign of the cross. And I walk
Ooh.
into the bush, and as soon as I walk into the bush, I take off my hat and I make the sign of the cross and I say thank you for having me here.
You know, as you're saying that, what's hitting me is that's beautiful. And I think a beautiful thing to add that now I'm wondering if I might want to do, it would be something like holy water with the sign of the cross, is the sense of like sprinkling
Yeah.
holy water, like, thank you. Like, here's an offering. Thank you so much. Yeah, something like that. That's beautiful. Which again is funny that you're saying that, the connect Christian connection, because if you go back to something like Margaret Barker and her talking about those ancient shamanic things, the shamanic. I mean, again, that word is being misused. It should only be used for Siberian Siberian indigenous practice, but oh well. Um, but that practice from the Hebrew tribe, and she makes the comment that, like, in that first tabernacle in the desert, that nomadic thing that then becomes the first temple, um, is that the practices there would look something like what you're saying, almost like ceremony and leaving markings. And she's like, and if you talk about sprinkling blood or whatever in a temple, but it wouldn't be just that; you'd be marking it with holy oil. And so the oil would be an anointing. And so you anoint here, you anoint, and so everything gets anointed. And so then I'm thinking, okay, but the Christian version of that kind of is, yes, we have oil, and you could, I guess, but I think like holy water, is kind of like a sprinkling, which would be like leaving tobacco or corn or something, cornmeal or, um, and it's interesting because in the other traditions too, because I wonder what they're doing. They must be doing something similar, but uh, culturally different in like Africa or South America. I'm not sure like what they're leaving as offerings, you know. Um, but that's a beautiful thing right there. See, because you've just been trained automatically. That's the key. Is I just want the clues, little clues like that. I don't need to take their culture. I just need to notice the moments of where they notice. Like that's what I want. I just want the insight of like they notice this and then something gets done. Okay, I won't copy you, but the fact that you notice this, that's important for me because I wouldn't. I've been trained to ignore it. I needed someone to point it out to me, so I need to know where to notice it. And then and then maybe the new thing can develop. Like I don't have to be taking it from their culture. Uh,
No one's saying thank you to a tree. It's like sitting around a fire, right? Like nobody gets to own that. The songs, if you're gonna show up with a headdress and you're gonna start smudging people and stuff, then obviously that's someone's culture.
yeah,
But if you're walking around the bush and saying thank you to stuff and you're,
yeah,
just noticing the moon and how beautiful it is and saying thank you, I mean, no one gets to own that. That's just
that's right.
universal. The deer do it too, and
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah, that's beautiful. The deer do it too, 100%.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's great. Do you still do in kind of a Christian version? Do you do kind of vision fasts and things for people? Do you bring people out still, or no? That you don't do that anymore?
I've done a little bit. I've gone out on my own a bunch of times in a Christian way. So I had communion as my last meal, and then I do my fast, and then I break my fast with communion.
That's
Um,
fantastic.
and I've done two fasting camps where I've taken some friends out and put them out to fast, and we've had a fire and I put fasters out, but we didn't do any sweat lodge, anything like that. But I did kind of keep the format a little bit. And just for some context, anyone who's listening, my elder was all about wanting the whole world to learn his tradition. So the way that I was taught it was he wanted me to
Yep.
carry it. But so instead of like the whole fasting camp, it's like a week-long ceremony, and there's like different parts of it that are different things. And so there will be multiple sweat lodges, which are their own ceremony in their own right, but they're lodged within the lodges are lodged within a larger
Right.
ceremonial context. So instead of sweats, every time I would have done a sweat, we did a communion service around the fire. We did a lot of chanting. Uh,
Mm,
chanting the Psalms and chanting some medieval Celtic poetry from my book Psalter of the Birds and stuff like that. And I put people out to fast. I checked on them every day and did this, I encouraged one young woman to speak with the trees, and that was really fruitful. She got a lot out of that. And struggled a little bit at first with feeling awkward. And I told her the same thing my elder told me. I hope she doesn't mind me saying this. I didn't say her name.
yeah.
I told
Yeah.
her this.
You didn't say her name. We don't know who it is. Yeah.
I told her the same thing my elder told me, which is that if you feel awkward talking, praying to the trees, just tell them that. Say, I'm here and I don't know why I'm here, and this feels really stupid and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if you can even hear me, but here I am. And if you have something to teach me, I want to learn it. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just you saying that brings me to tears. I mean, it's just, which is really funny because, if somebody had said that to me about 15 years ago, I'd look at them all weird. But like I've gotten to this place now doing enough embodied work and realizing the kind of the truth of that, of what you're saying here, that there is something profoundly true about what you just said, and beautiful. So, yeah, I'm so grateful that you're sharing that. I mean, it's just so insightful. I mean, because I haven't had the privilege of being apprenticed in that way, and to have that. And the other thing too, I try to say, which is really important, I think, one of the main themes is really trying to, like you said, on some level, we need to kind of go back and study what was done and kind of recover some of that, of course. And so, as I've just tipped my hand, like if I know where the places I'm supposed to be looking and like when do they look for something? When do they say something? Like kind of do they, how do they start? How do they finish? Or do they, like if you just give me the places, kind of like the markings, that's how I can look back and figure out. I don't have to copy exactly, but I'm just looking for those kind of bare bones, that skeleton. And then the other piece is really that it really has to be fresh. It has to be new now because it's a living thing. And ceremony changed in their culture too, because they would adapt it all the time because people change and trees change, everything moves.
And
So if the culture,
tradition is based on dreams, sorry. Like
yeah,
someone has a dream and now there's a new ceremony and a new tradition. You go
yeah,
to powwows everywhere and everyone's got jingle dresses on. It's like it's this massive thing. You'd think it was ancient, but it was some when a grandmother had a vision back in the 80s or something that the jingle dress would heal the people, and now everyone jingle dresses and it's traditional, but it's not ancient. Um,
right.
yeah,
There you go.
yeah,
That's great. It's
yeah,
traditional, but not ancient. That's beautifully stated.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. Like, how can we do something that's traditional and that's, or maybe the Christian word might be orthodox, like it follows the line, whatever you want to call it, but it's not ancient, it's new for this time. It's the spirit moving here, right? The Holy Spirit, and then the spirits that it enlivens, or he enlivens or she enlivens, or however you want to talk about spirit. Um, and so yeah, so I'm really kind of interested in that and trying to give myself permission for that because for so long I come from a culture that it needs to be traditional and that means needs to be ancient. And now I realize that that distinction you just made, I'm like, no, it can be traditional but new. It's not but it's following the thread, it's growing, it's moved, and yet it's still in line with what's come from before. Um,
That's every great name in the tradition is something like that. You mentioned Francis, right? And Francis came and did something new that was traditional, and so did Benedict, and so did a
yep.
hundred million other people. Um,
Yep.
yeah,
Hildegard of Bingen and, and
yeah,
Julian of Norwich and, just
yeah,
name them all, St. Patrick,
yeah.
etc. So, yeah, yeah. So are you doing um, the Celtic tradition? Have you recovered kind of Aboriginal, kind of indigenous Celtic practices too? Or has it mostly just been kind of Celtic Christianity? Or has it been a crossover for you? How has that worked?
I started with an interest in Celtic pagan stuff before Christianity,
Yeah,
because I
makes
didn't
sense.
want to be a Christian, and it was actually the spirits who told me that I needed to seek that path, which is a whole different story.
That's fantastic. I
I,
love
I,
it.
I could tell sometime. Yeah, and so the truth is, we don't know really much at all
Right.
about the pre-Christian stuff. And what we do know comes from Christians writing centuries later.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you find a lot of Celtic pagan stuff emerging in the late Middle Ages, which is a really fascinating thing. And there's debate about, is it an oral tradition that survived and finally resurfaced all these centuries later, or is it almost a medieval neo-pagan movement that's doing what neo-pagans today are doing, of trying to kind of reconstruct and reintegrate this same conversation we're having now? That's what I think. In the late Middle Ages, you see this sort of, especially in the Welsh and Irish, you find this resurgence of interest in the pre-Christian myths and stories, Cuchulainn and the gods and all that kind of stuff, as well as the bardic poetic tradition. And what the Welsh in particular, they revived this idea of Awen and this sense of the spiritual energy of inspiration. And some of the stuff
Yep.
you read in the Welsh medieval poetry, that's Christian poetry. It mentions Jesus, it talks about salvation, it's all this kind of advising you to do penance and all that kind of stuff. And then they're also talking about the nature of Awen and how it begins in the beginning of all things. Where does inspiration itself come from, and how it flows like rivers and water through us? And um, so yeah, I love all that stuff. And there's this. So you have those bits from the later part, and then you have some surviving records from the early medieval period when you have the actual sort of syncretism is the word I'm looking for,
Yeah.
happening as people are converting. And so you have like the Voyage of Bran, for instance,
Yep.
which is the precursor to the more famous Voyage of Brendan.
Yep.
And in it, it's a pagan story, and they're going to the pagan otherworld, and they crossing across the sea, and they run into Mananan MacLear, who's the god of the sea, and he gives them a prophecy about Jesus. And you're like, okay, now this is pretty cool. Um,
That's
and
good.
and there's lots of fun stuff like that that I really like to play with and think about. So there is a lot of, especially in the realm of story or myth, in that sort of broad, generous sense of myth, not as falsity, but as
Right. Right.
um, cultural
Sacred
narrative
story.
and
Yeah.
sacred story.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff like that. The lives of the saints and the animals they encounter, and they're out there in the wilderness talking to birds and stuff.
I know it's great.
Um, and so I think that for me, that's one of the real treasure stores of how we can, gain back this pre-modern, whatever the word you want to use is, understanding
Right.
from a Christian perspective, is to go and read the life of Saint Bridget or the life of Saint David and realize like, oh, wait a minute, these like St. Bridget just has conversations with animals all the time. Like they're it's the same as people for her. Um, and
Yeah, exactly.
it's pretty cool. There are some hints at Celtic Christian practices that would fall into this category. Like there's one, the Chaldee monks, for instance, the Cayley Day, were this Irish reform movement. They were strict ascetics, and in a lot of ways, not something people today would want to emulate.
Right.
Um, but they had a lot of really cool stuff like this. There's one thing they called the Shrine of Devotion, which I've been playing with and we used at our Christian fasting camp, where they face each of the four directions.
Hmm.
And then they face the earth, and then they face the sky. And that's
Hmm.
the exact same pattern I learned in ceremony, where you start in the east, and they start in the east, and you go east, south, west, north, Mother Earth, Father Sky, and you face each of those directions, and you put tobacco down in each of those directions. That's how I learned it in ceremony. And what the Cayley Day monks were doing long before any contact, like this is, before the first millennium, probably like in the 900s, 800s.
Okay.
They would say the Lord's Prayer and make the sign of the cross in each of the four directions, and then the earth, and then the sky. Um, and when I read that, I was like, "Oh snap! Like this is," and you kind of get into like, well, why are they doing that? What is this pattern? And it's the sun, right? The sun rises in the east, in the northern hemisphere at least. It passes through the south, sets in the west, hides underground in the north, and then rises again once more. And so by this embodied movement, you're actually embodying the path of the sun, traveling
That's
through the sky.
fantastic.
And they did it in a thoroughly Christian context where they're saying the Pater Noster in Latin and they're making the sign of the cross, and I don't know where they got it
Wow.
from, but it's beautiful. So there's some
That's
stuff like
that
that
is
you can find.
fantastic.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. See,
Yeah.
that's the kind of stuff that's great that like you even found that. Like
Yeah.
that's gold. That's gold. Because I mean that does give you inspiration because like you said, ceremony. And so then you say, oh wow, look at this connection. Because I would have asked myself, like, why are they doing because I don't know the ceremony, right? So I would have been like, why are we doing it in this direction and in this pattern, and like I told you, I'm pretty convinced that it was all sorts of things like the desert masters, darn well they had to be doing something like that. They're down there in Egypt, out in the desert watching the sun and and etc. They have to be praying to the winds and the rain gods and the thunder clouds, and they have to, like, it just has to be. And I'm sure there's a Christian way they were doing it, but there had to have been something like what you've just described. And it's sad that it was lost. It's because I'm pretty convinced there was just like that, like you alluded to before, the sense that all of a sudden this is quote heresy, and so then we're going to burn books and we're going to stop that stuff. Um, it just like the stories that you do hear about when Christians bumped into pagan traditions and did horrible things, like what's his name? Is it Bede cutting down the holy tree or something?
Oh,
And
there's a few songs that cut down the holy trees. Merton was one of them too. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh, it's
Yeah, but
like
then
every
other
time I hear
churches are
those stories,
built on around the holy tree, like yeah.
yeah, and I'm just like, oh, you're just absolutely killing me, devastating.
Mhm.
Yeah, so uh, that that darn well there had to have been ways of doing that, and I'm pretty sure that that was the context for Jesus himself, that he was seeing his father and spirit, etc., making this world and the world of beings, you know um but yeah, so I mean that's the place I'm at, and I'm really kind of sitting in that new place now and trying to figure out what that looks like and what I'm going to do, and like kind of, because where's my place in that, like I don't know, like what would be fun is like you and I could do something, like we could team up and do something fantastic together, because ceremony, and you could be showing me fasting. I mean, I'd go to a fasting place with you and do that all day. I would definitely do that. I mean, and then what would it be like? Like what would it be like to to add like a focusing piece so that people could bring that in, so that they know more about their body and something wakes up for them, so that they can bring it into ceremony. And so I'm like, what is my space here? Is it just like doing focus? Like, so for instance, there is a Christian version of focusing. So focusing started off, it's secular, anyone can do it. And most people feel very comfortable with it, using it, and it helps with therapy, it helps with education, it helps with a lot of things. But then it can be used in spiritual ways. So there was a book called written by a Tibetan Buddhist. The book's called Your Body Knows the Answer. It's really short. I'm pretty sure it's Shambhala Publications that does it. It is fantastic. I tell everyone to read it because it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist or not. It does a really great job of teaching focusing, but he also connects it with kind of meditation practice and kind of Buddhist practice. He calls it mindful focusing. And so he puts that together. Well, two Jesuit priests in the 60s and 70s met Eugene Genlin, found out about focusing. They had a Jesuit background with all the imagination and the training of the mind following St. Ignatius of Loyola. And they were also psychologists. And then they bump into this and they go, oh my Lord. And so they develop a thing called biospiritual focusing, which is, it tries to be very ecumenical and open to anyone. It doesn't push any religious agenda, but I mean, it's clearly Christian. And they say it all the time. They talk about agape and about God and Christ and what it means to be in the body of Christ, and that you're part of a bigger body. And so your body in touch with all other bodies, and this is what it means to be in Christ. And so I'm being trained in biospiritual focusing right now. I got my focusing certification, and now I'm adding this component to bring it into kind of a spiritual place. So I mean, I could do something like that too. I mean, and that could be a piece of what I do. But there is this other piece which I'm really motivated about, kind of cultural regeneration. Like the place I'm sitting in, it's brand new. I don't know what to say about it because I don't know. But other than I'm reading and grieving kind of the way our culture is at the moment. And I get the sense I'm not the only one who thinks this, that there's something that's kind of dying in our culture. That's just not a healthy, sustainable culture, and that it's transforming currently, and things are going to shift, maybe drastically. And then some people in the past election that's just happened have kind of really felt that maybe something has really turned the corner here, and that there might be some big changes happening economically, politically, on all levels. And so I just kind of rethinking about what would it look like, a more environmentally friendly, sustainable way of living in the world that kind of holds on to the best of what we got, but also revisits everything we've been talking about for the last hour about how can you incorporate in a modern way something that looks a little more animist, that really recognizes that this isn't superstition, that it's really how humans know, and that we really should be revisiting, and how there's just like, it's just so missing in our culture. And so I follow some people who are doing kind of cultural change work. One of the thinkers who currently he's slowing down in his teaching as he's getting older and dealing with some health issues. But one of the teachers from your country up there in Canada is Stephen Jenkinson, and he's writing books and talking about all sorts of things. And he'll say he has a school that he calls the Orphan Wisdom School, and he talks about how we as a culture, North America, Western civilization, just doesn't. It isn't tribal and isn't grounded in the land, and it doesn't talk to the land or the trees or whatever. We just don't connect. And so we don't have ceremony, and we don't have these things, and we don't have initiations, and we don't have things that human cultures do that allow us to grow and mature and be older and listen and talk and show gratitude and all that kind of stuff. We're not doing it. And so we're like homeless, basically. We live on land, but we're not actually home there. And so then he's like, we have to figure out as orphans now, how to like kind of find and create a home, learn those skills again. And he's learned from native traditions, and he's been, blessed by people like your teacher. He learned things and they told him to teach. And so he's trying to do things without creating other natives. You know, he's like saying, "Hey, be who you are." But like we have to figure out what this looks like. And so he's trying to he gathers people and they just kind of sit in a quiet way and just almost like kind of sitting around and like what almost like a Quaker meeting, what's moving us and like maybe the spirit speaking us a way forward into doing that kind of thing. And I'm really interested in that. I'm really kind of interested in that as a Christian, really making struggling kind of institutionally with the church, noticing its brokenness, struggling with the institution of like the United States government. Well, not just the United States government, all governments seem to be problematic on some level for me, and all sorts of things. So I don't want to reject any of those things. I kind of want to embrace them and hold on to them. But we really do need to imagine new ways forward. And I'm interested in that work. I feel like I'm called in that direction. I just don't know what that looks like. And it's really big. And I'm just wondering what my small little piece is in there. I'm trying to figure what that looks like now. But that's kind of where my spirit is currently. And I know, just to end it, I know, end that thought and to hear from you is I know it's connected with this kind of knowing, a kind of animism, a kind of environmental sustainability, some kind of spiritual rediscovery or reconnection. And it's holding all those pieces together in that kind of interreligious, safe way. Even though I might identify as Christian, how do I do that in a way that's respectful to my neighbors and learn from them and walk with them? Um, it's kind of where I'm at. So
Yeah, that's awesome. It's very relatable. I mean, growing up Quaker and a hippie, I grew up on an organic farm. Um, and I built a straw bale house, and I thought I was going to be an organic farmer. I was very into permaculture and natural building, and a huge concern for the environment, which I still have. Um, but the truth is, I did that in my early 20s, especially quite intensely, and then I realized that I wasn't going to change the world growing
that's
organic
right.
potatoes, right?
That's right.
Like
That's
the
right.
all the oil's going to get used, and my little self-sufficient resistance isn't going to change anything or matter. Um, and I also realized that I was incapable of living a sustainable lifestyle
That's right.
because when in the past humanity had a more sustainable lifestyle, it was a whole society doing it, right?
That's right.
And so if you're gonna go out and you're gonna, have a hippie commune and you're gonna do a permaculture thing and you're gonna grind your own grain, you're gonna churn your own butter, you're gonna weave your own cloth, you're gonna,
Right.
right, like all this stuff, you can't do it. And no one could. No
Right.
one ever has in history, right? Everybody
Right.
was part of a
That's right.
society that was doing it. And so I found that I was, driving my truck with gas in it to go pick up my organic fertilizer for my, and I'm like, what is what is the big picture here? What's happening? And I had a
Yeah.
sort of epiphany that we can't fix the environmental crisis until we change people's hearts.
That's right.
That it doesn't matter. Like the facts are there, the science is in. It's been in for a long time. There's
Yep.
a unanimous, with except for a few weird outliers who are just trying to get attention, there's a unanimous scientific consensus, which doesn't happen that often, that the environmental crisis is real. We've either are approaching the tipping point of no return or perhaps have already crossed it. And
Yep.
the governments just don't care enough because we
Yep.
can't get people to vote for it, and the companies don't want to change. There's too much inertia.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I don't know that I'm going to be able to change the world with my spiritual teachings, but my hope is the thing I feel called to is to, I don't want to say create a tradition because that sounds like something different than what I'm trying to do because I want to be within the Christian tradition and I am within the Christian tradition,
Yep.
but a branch of Christianity, an expression of Christianity that's holistic and does all this. And so I write liturgies and I write theology and I organize community, and I want it to be a whole package deal because that's one of the things I realized in, like in ceremony, everything's all one. It's
That's
all it's
right.
all connected, and you can try and have, animistic or land-based practices, but if you don't have the stories to go with them, then they're not going to
Yes.
bear the same fruit. And if you don't
Yes.
have the theology behind it, the teachings, the philosophy behind it that matches it, people aren't going
Yes.
to be convinced. And you need a whole package deal. So that's kind of my work right now, is to establish this sort of larger framework in which all of these things are interrelated and connected and possible. And it's a huge
Yes.
project, and it means I'm writing like literally 10 books at once, and I have no idea when any of them will be published.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, right.
but
No, I
anyway,
think you're
that's my,
nailing it.
yeah.
You're nailing it. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, you're dead on. I mean, I agree 100% with that. I mean, that's why I realized, similar to you, I'm like, I'm not going to go live off, the grid. I'm not going to do what you just said, like, because it's not going to do anything. So then what's my role to play here? And I realized that, well, I think it's kind of like using my education, that I was always good at school, and I was a pretty good storyteller and a good presenter. I can get up and do something more bardic, poetic and whatever. I can do that. And so I'm like, all right, so maybe it is just kind of like poking and prodding in this space in various ways, online, universities, creating spaces where educationally waking up the heart, and just saying, like, let's wake up the heart and then wonder together. And I can't fix it, but maybe if we can do that, and if I do some writing, very similar to you, if I can do some writing and some podcasting and creating some either music or some spoken word or experiences or pilgrimages or things where I can help people train and see and wake up something, that that's where the space is. That's all I really can do. And then I have to just trust that spirit or whatever takes over and wakes, once we see it, as my student said in class, he's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It really does affect. He's like, it really affects everything I do. And I'm like, that's kind of funny. And he was like, he said to me, he was like, I think he was trying to impress on me that, he didn't say it, but he gave me the sense that he was trying to say to me that the class was that important to him, that now that he's seen it, like, he's not going to be able to live his life different, and he doesn't know what that means, because because we're talking about it. I was like, yeah, but you have to go get a job. Like, you're not going to go live on a farm. You're not going to go live in the wilderness and do this, like, wild theology, whatever that is. Right. I mean, like, I don't know what that means yet. I mean, it might mean something eventually, that, like, but we're just at this space of kind of, how do we start to wake things up so that we can have a society that tells the stories, that does the things, that does, I mean, and that's probably where I'm at. I'm probably just going to have to be the one who is helping, be present for people so that they can notice their body is talking to them, and so is the tree, and that'll probably be good enough, or it has to be, because I'm not sure what more I can do. Because just like you said, you nailed it. I can't do all those things. I can't grind the grain and live off the grid, and I just can't do all of it, and it's not going to matter anyway. You know, um, yeah,
Yeah. Well, here's to imagining new hopes.
yeah. Here's to the just being open to the spirit being the one. I think the beautiful thing is I don't have to do it, right? Spirit has to do it, or God, and however you want to talk about the divine and all the living spirits that are part of this cosmos. It's not like me just doing it. But I think the beautiful thing, and maybe the hopeful thing, like you said, imagining, is that in these what so-called animist cultures, is that our spirit is in relation with with all spirit. So it's not like I'm removed and can't do anything. Just even my little work of just waking up spirit and being present to it and being gratitude and passing that on to my kids and modeling it to my students, and that's that tumbling. And the Eugene Gendlin made the comment, he, when he was talking about focusing, and he said, if you just do the focusing session once, he goes, that's it, you've been changed forever. Because, like, something's opened up and you might subconsciously not realize it, but something has shifted, because they notice that people will go to therapy for years talking about their problems, their depression, their anxiety, whatever. And just talking about it doesn't do it. But if you focus and talk, and then let your body and be present to the way your body's carrying that problem, traumatic things, like all that trauma gets processed and the body moves forward and you carry, and now you're different. And so they were finding that people would, and they would never say this before, but Jenlin would say it. They would like, they were coming to therapy for 25 years, doing talk therapy. And then they did 4 focusing sessions and they were healed. And he goes, and I say that healed. They didn't have to come back. They were no longer dealing with that anxiety issue anymore that they had been talking about for 25 years because they were just talking about it, but they weren't really turning and saying what's going on and once they connected the thinking and the feeling, their body moved forward. They call it shifting, carrying it forward. And the living process that was stopped moved forward and you can live a new life. I just think that our culture is kind of in a stopped process. And if we can wake it up, it will move forward and the next thing will be imagined, you know. And I think a bunch of us that's the work we're all doing, is we're just trying to wake up that process or let that process move forward.
Wow, it's beautiful. A good place to end too. I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up.
Yeah, it
Uh,
is good. I
could,
appreciate your time and letting me babble. No one lets me talk that long.
I like to listen. My elder always said you have 2 ears and one mouth because you're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk.
Your elder was a very, very wise man. He's absolutely correct.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, and I look forward to chatting again. Maybe we'll do this again sometime, or who
Yeah,
knows? I'm,
anytime.
yeah.
Maybe a particular topic next time. I look forward to reading your books and collaborate. I'm up for collaboration. It sounds like you made me smile today. You're doing stuff that I love. So have at it, my friend. You're doing a great job. We need you doing that work, my friend.
Well, thank you, and the feeling is mutual. Yeah. All right. Well, you take care and have a good night.
Yeah, same to you. Take care now.
Cheers.
Cheers.